All right, good morning and welcome to Web3 Wednesdays, where we chat through some of the complex and nuanced topics in crypto and Web3 at large so that you can stay ahead of the curve. So today I am joined by Sarutobi of Yield Guild Games, colloquially known as YGG, which is arguably the largest Web3 gaming guild in the world with tens of thousands of players spanning across a myriad of games and a huge portfolio of partners and acquired assets to boot. So YGG was instrumental in creating the very first wave of massive play-to-earn movements, starting with the rise of Axie Infinity, and they remain at the forefront of the space as a Web3 gaming continues to evolve. So Sarutobi here is the head of partnerships at YGG, and he sits at the cutting edge of both guild and gaming development, bringing to the table more Web3 gaming experience than almost anyone else in the space today. And we're keen to hear his takes on lessons learned in building guilds, their place within the broader Web3 ecosystem, and where gaming goes from here. So Sarutobi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Great to be on the show.
All right. Well, so for those unfamiliar, could you give a brief 1-minute intro or so, on YGG and your personal involvement at large, within Web3 gaming? Because I understand you've been involved with guilds for ages at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you've said, I think YGG is the kind of premier play-to-earn blockchain gaming guild. We have been around since the inception. I think we're the first that has kind of tokenized and launched, and we've had a huge amount of success in that regard. We're definitely one of the most well-connected guilds in the space and have a very broad portfolio of extremely high-profile games. We kind of came out of the Axie community quite predominantly, and for a while we're almost certainly the largest Axie Infinity guild in existence. We had a huge amount of success in that regard, and from there we decided to start making more, get more exposure to new and exciting gaming projects and infrastructure plays. And we've obviously grown quite extensively now, kind of covering like the YGG core as the primary DAO, and then having all the sub DAOs beneath us, some of which are kind of focused on specific geographical areas, and some which might be focused on games specifically as well. My role in YGG is as head of partnerships. I work very closely with upcoming game projects, kind of analyzing their economies, looking at how they're designed, seeing whether they'd be a good fit for the guild model. Then afterwards, after we've made the decision to acquire assets or have some involvement with the gaming project, I'd often be involved on an ongoing basis in terms of, looking at how continuing to be involved in how things are designed, how they're, what they're doing. We obviously do a lot of events as well, like AMAs and community orientated events, which I often take part in as well. So there's a kind of this ongoing relationship component as well to what I do. But obviously there's a huge scope of different types of projects that want to partner with YGG across a whole range of different kind of product categories. So I'm quite lucky in that, and you of which are one, Sam, so I've had the joy of speaking to you quite a few times in relation to the guild tooling product, Capital DAO, for example. So, in that sense, then I'm quite lucky in that, like, the acquisitions team of YGG, is primarily looking at a lot of games, but I from a partnerships angle, I get the opportunity to actually look at sometimes an even broader spectrum of projects, which is an extremely interesting thing for me, and has been, like, as you've mentioned, like, hugely educational over the last few months to see, like, this space just absolutely explode with different takes on how to position a project.
I love that. Yeah, and YGG within the space to date and the impact that it's had has been substantial, right? And we've had a ton of fun working with you on the Guild Infrastructure project to that degree. And I think, kind of getting to this idea of, value that you guys provide to games and broader ecosystem partners, et cetera, there are a ton of these hyper-vocal Twitter warriors that come out and they bash guilds as being, purely value extractive vehicles. They enter games, decimate economies, leave none standing. How do you see that situation? Do you agree with them? To what extent? How do you kind of sit there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it's an understandable point to make, but I think guilds are hugely important for the games that I speak to. Many of the projects that we've been involved with are hugely grateful for our involvement in terms of obviously the financial commitments that we make, the time commitments that we make in terms of, I think YGG, I can't speak for necessarily every single guild in the space, but YGG especially, we take a hugely vested interest in working with the game projects we partner with, which includes, like I said, consulting and advising on the how the token economies are designed, how the game mechanics works, how the games are designed to support guilds. Obviously, some economic models, when you have like extraction occurring, don't hold up to this. And I think one of the reasons for that is that games haven't necessarily been able to attract value additive players, or haven't been able to design their economies in such a robust way that if value extraction is occurring, to kind of like stem this kind of downward trend. It is an extremely challenging thing to build. I mean, building video games is challenging on its own, and then building games with like functional economies on top of that, where there is the ability to take something out, is really challenging, because if you have the ability to take something out of an economy, then you will see these people who want to take profit from these opportunities occur. So I think that guilds provide a whole range of different values in terms of like the player base, obviously, that come into those games, but obviously it's easy to see how there's a kind of positives and negatives about those players, because I think that's where it's the guild's responsibility and this is a evolving thing of how, as guilds, we do have a responsibility to try and ensure that our players are value additive within game economies. And I think that as our infrastructure improves, and maybe this is even something where like Capital DAO could maybe come in and play some kind of role there potentially, or other tools as well, which I'm aware of in the space, to be able to identify who the most value additive players are within specific games. I mean, I think it is actually quite often the game's responsibility to try and implement structures in which rewards are aligned with people that are performing certain actions. And I think we're still at such an early stage of the game with kind of blockchain gaming, that we are going to see some economies collapse. It is a valid criticism. I think that guilds as a whole do need to kind of work on this, but I think the guild model is quickly evolving into many other different value add areas, and also, of course, things like esports, content creation, sometimes incorporating like more tech stack on top of what they're doing, also kind of looking at like the user base. We're seeing a move away from like guilds as just like a kind of glorified scholarship, to guilds being like homes for collaboration. Because if we look at many of the games that are currently in development in the space, many of them are going to require like mass collaboration, and sometimes the kind of earning piece of some of these games isn't going to be huge. And the kind of big challenge there is like, as guilds, how will they have a meaningful role in like putting people in these environments in a way that kind of still makes sense for the guild, and still makes sense for the game, and still makes sense for the players. But I definitely think the role of the guild is evolving into something that's very valuable to games. But obviously, if we look at some games, the way that they're designed, unfortunately, it's often the kind of the game's economy that's weak in some of these instances.
100%. Yeah, and I think that we aligned quite well on that across the board, because from my perspective, obviously guilds being the largest players sometimes outright in some of these games, basically held by a single entity, you have a massive sway over the economic implications of whatever you've carried out. And so it is obviously in the guild's responsibility to make sure that they're careful with the economy. They don't inadvertently dump things, because you can obviously carry out some pretty crazy financial machinations there. But I do think that a pretty strong case can be made that it's really on the game's responsibility here to make sure that they are robust, because at the end of the day, a guild is just bringing in a ton of players and a ton of capital, which in my opinion is exactly what a game should want. That's like what you should be looking for, is a ton of players and a ton of capital. So it's exciting to me to kind of see games evolve into a position where they can handle that level of volume versus some of these really early play to earn type games that just couldn't handle and collapsed under that level of pressure.
For sure. And I mean, I think that like it's important not to, some of these collapsed economies could eventually revitalize. I mean, if we look at like real world economies, sometimes they crash and sometimes they come back and sometimes they don't, so it remains to be seen how, some of these economies will fare over kind of a longer time horizon. I definitely think that it's extremely interesting to see how these economies are developing, and guilds. I mean, speaking for YGG specifically, I think we have a track record of being quite responsible with regards to our assets. I mean, in Axie in particular, like we have like been extremely good, and I don't think we've like sold hardly any assets in that regard, and have been hugely supportive of the Axie economy. And I do actually have a big belief of of both Axie Infinity and Sky Mavis's whole ecosystem having a potentially very bright future ahead of it.
Nice. Yeah, and I like this kind of angle of, guilds in some capacity can be outright very supportive of economies. And I think an interesting question, when new games launch that you guys have supported or you are participating in, either behind the scenes or outright publicly, have you noticed any substantial difference in user acquisition velocity, right? When you guys take a role in that game deploying, have you seen, a substantial change between those games versus other games that basically deploy without guild support?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it depends on the nature of the game. I mean, and it's also about how the game is designed as well. Because if we look at some games now that that are free to play, either in the browser or mobile, user acquisition can be fairly straightforward for them. But is it the right users though? And how are those users, are those users valuable for the game in question? I think that as if you look at the kind of people that make up play to earn blockchain gaming guilds, many are slightly more adept on the Web3 side of things. They've really been kind of trained up. They often are aware of how to spin up wallets, and some of the players I think coming into these newer games, some of which I don't think guilds are like a complete and utter must-have necessity, but at the same time, I think that within certain games they're going to be hugely valuable for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and we're starting to see games, develop that are building in guild-specific features, right? So methods by which,
Absolutely.
if you're a guild, you own a castle, you can label your castle, you can place advertisements, etc., things like that. And I think that's going to drive some really neat social engagement interactions here over the next 2 years or so. And I think, kind of even thinking about this industry moving forward, play to earn, that was a whole story arc on its own, right? I mean, that was an awesome demonstration of lightning in a bottle and what this type of technology can really enable. And so, where do you see the state of play to earn today? Is the idea dead, essentially, right? And, if it is or if it isn't, where does the Web3 gaming economy kind of evolve from here? Do you see it going in any specific direction?
I think it's going to go in a lot of different directions. I think the kind of proclaiming play to earn as dead, I think is a little bit. I think if play to earn had a voice, it says the rumors of my death have been much exaggerated. Would be, I get it. I get the criticism of like play to earn and this sort of this all these arguments that we hear over the semantics of how to phrase this. I mean, for me, I only had this conversation there recently about how I would sometimes maybe think about classifying this more as like blockchain gaming. Right. I don't think that like these kind of taglines of play to earn or play to own. I mean, some of this stuff is all, like I said, it's kind of like sticky semantics that are kind of fairly meaning. I mean, I see this kind of being like, okay, blockchain based games. And I think eventually like we're just going to see it's like games that just happen to use. We don't even need to see that, it's just like these ones happen to use like this tech behind it. I mean, I suppose like, again, like blockchain games for me would be a good way of looking at it. Some might kind of have like more clearly designed economies, and some might like not have any, you might not be able to extract value out of some future games. But then there's always, as of right now, like theoretically you can't extract value from Fortnite, but that doesn't stop people making loads of money off Fortnite. So like there's all kind of, I think we'll definitely see like we'll see like a lot. I think we are seeing like a lot of move towards like a kind of Web 2.5 approach, where we're seeing games that are really trying to zoom in on the the play as opposed to the earn piece. But I mean, for me, some of the most tantalizing and exciting stuff is those games where, like, right, okay, we'll design this game in such a way so that the ownership piece should lead to some ability to earn, maybe. I think that, me personally, I try not to get too involved in these kind of semantic based arguments over should we play to earn, play and earn, play for fun and maybe earn. Me personally, I just think I prefer to sometimes call it blockchain games. Do you know?
I've written about that before, where I wish we would stop calling it all these things, and I would just call it games, right? At the end of the day, these are just games. Like in traditional Web2 gaming, no one asks whether your backend database is like a SQL database or it's some other like a separate server setup. Like, no one cares. It's not important. It's an underlying technology. So I agree with you. I think, some of these really interesting ownership structures that may emerge where, ultimately maybe you earn, right? Because you spent 10,000 hours grinding and you've got the best sword that anyone's ever found. You can kill things faster. Great. Maybe you can earn, right? But it's definitely going to be, in my opinion, also like a spectrum of different results that we come out of this start here. Yeah.
And I'm seeing, obviously we're seeing a lot of move towards like skill-based games.
Right.
I think some of the kind of passive earning, some of the ideas are like, passively being able to earn is, clearly has like some sustainability issues. So we are seeing a lot of move towards skill-based gaming, but that makes sense. And I think that some of this was just, experiment, like we were at such an experimental phase. Now we're seeing, games coming into the space that are much more like they're actually games, as opposed to just being kind of like gamified DeFi experiments. And I think that's really positive for the space. And I mean, one kind of way of phrasing it that I always love to say to people, to kind of put it into like just how early and just how exciting this space is. Look at the amount of capital that has flooded into this space, primarily off the back of one single game. But like, if you look at YGG, most guilds out there that have tokenized and a whole slew of infrastructure and all these different projects, and they've raised probably at this point billions of dollars between all of them. And all of this has primarily become of one game that was never even available on the App Store, never even available in the Google Play Store, and it was a big breakout success. What will happen when we see a game that actually starts getting real Web 2 adoption and the Web 3 adoption occur? Like, that scares me. Like,
I completely agree.
It gives my hair tingling, but like it really is exciting to think about what will be the repercussions of a real success. And that's not to say that games so far haven't been successful, but like in real world terms, like how many, like we've seen some big like daily active user numbers, but have these necessarily been like Web 2 hits? I think when we see this kind of like Web 2, Web 3 crossover hit, that's gonna be something to see. I think the implications of that could just be absolutely mind-blowing. And again, I've had this conversation quite a few times. Me personally, it's really a case of a when, not an if. And what's even more scary is like, look at the impact of one game, and then we're saying, what about one more? But what about a world where we have like 5 or 10? Oh yeah, and by the way, now that you can suddenly start using these assets across the different experiences, it's like, wow, okay, that is the metaverse. And I mean,
it's hugely exciting.
I think the term metaverse is horribly used sometimes by some projects saying, oh, I'm building a metaverse. From my understanding and my definition, I know it's a very personal thing for a lot of people, but my understanding of what the metaverse is a true evolution of the internet into a far more ubiquitous experience that has all these kind of components built into it that forms this kind of massively interactive experience of a kind of what we currently think of as the internet, but will in the future be this really interesting interconnected experience of all these different worlds.
I love that you brought that up, because it is, we've chatted about a couple of the big hypey terms here, right? Play to earn, metaverse, right? I do think most of these roll over into something that looks like, just standard definitions. Again, it is basically the internet, except now you own things, right? And so as we move away from the hyper marketing, I think that some of the Web 2 people will come back into the fold. There'll be less offended by the NFT verbiage and, some of the techno babble that we've applied broadly to the space. And then just like you said, that's when you get these really hair-raising enterprises where you have Web 2, Web 3 crossover, both players interacting together, and there's some form of ownership opt-in structure. And that's going to be like a very, very powerful engine driving the whole space forward. Which, I mean, even to this end, just to hypothesize for fun here, if you were to, be designing one of these games, right? Is there, any key little feature or any, neat little loop that has been, in the back of your head and you'd be like, wow, like I'd love to see that in a game sometime?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like depending on the type of game, I think there's a whole range of different kind of. I've stored from all the conversations over the months, and at this point, like year and a bit of time that I've been speaking to games, I definitely file away certain kind of mechanics. Some of the ones that really stand out to me is obviously, a lot of games wonder like, okay, how can you drive value to an asset that doesn't kind of break a game? And sometimes there's like separating like statistical ability of an item from the kind of the earning potential of an item. So this can be a scenario like some people say, oh, well, how can I make an FPS where like people are why would people want to buy a gold AK-47 and it's like, well, oh, maybe it's going to shoot better and get kills faster. It's like, well, that would just break the game and make it horrible. So the kind of obvious answer to this is, I mean, there was a time where it was like people really racked their brains about this, but it was quite clear. You just separate the financialized component and the game stats component. So it's like, okay, well, there's Sam and Sarutobi playing at an FPS arena. Sam has the bog standard AK-47, and I have the gold AK-47. You kill me, you earn nothing. I kill you, I earn something very small. Thus incentivizing the ownership of that asset through a financial mechanism. So that's a good mechanic to see. I definitely think though that having a free to play component is important. I think we've 100%. Seen within Fortnite, within some major games that kind of leverage free to play really successfully, that it can be a great way to drive user acquisition. And yeah, there's lots of other kind of mechanisms which I like to see. I mean, obviously, one that's kind of relevant to you guys is obviously like many games are building lending natively within them. So I think the ability to lend assets is hugely meaningful as well, especially to kind of legitimize the kind of in essence, like what has been known as the kind of scholarship model, but doesn't necessarily always have to be that. I mean, in kind of large scale MMO games, the ability to, some of these want to have the idea of like, oh, I'm a king or I'm a spacefaring lord or something like this. And in those kinds of games, like you'll never be able to play with all the assets that you acquire. So I think like lending as a tech is like hugely meaningful and important within.
Yeah, actually, Sarutobi, I really like that point because you're totally right. Even in a Web 2 capacity, right? Like my World of Warcraft bank is completely full of stuff that I will just absolutely never use. In EVE, I have tons of spaceships. Yeah, the ability to actually spread those out amongst other players, hugely powerful. And these idea of ownership is fun to talk about within this context, just because it hasn't been, so obviously possible up to, until today, when we can prove, on a public ledger, you own this asset, you can transfer and trade this asset. Everybody agrees on the terms of the asset. Before it was just centralized databases. And so this bit of blockchain really enables that. Super cool. And so, Sarutobi, as we kind of come to the end of this has been super fun. I really like this one. As an active participant, you are building certain Web3 ventures, you're participating in all these different things. Do you have any words of advice for folks who are trying to build in the same vein, right? Whether they're trying to build a Web3 game or a guild or anything around there, do you have any, neat nugget of wisdom that you could pass on to folks?
Yeah, gosh, that's a interesting question. I mean, I think I suppose it depends on what you're trying to do specifically, but like just keep your eyes and ears open. Don't ever feel like you have to be completely married to like if you I think we've seen a lot of games react to a development. So Axie blew up. Suddenly, we see all these 2 token economies. Don't be afraid to shift or change and redesign within reason. I mean, obviously, I know that can be in the gaming world can be really challenging, but like be fluid with your identity to some degree. And if that means like, going back to the drawing board and, as long as your budget allows, being able to redesign things, if you find a fatal flaw, don't like sometimes like pushing ahead with some, this is serious stuff. Potentially we're talking about like, a lot of people are, placing a lot of faith in studios, and, some of these kind of give themselves these kind of hard dates of, we're going to be launching at this date, but like if you can clearly see that like there may be flaws in your models, like from my understanding, and this is the same across guilds or across, as we see regulation change, I think we be fluid, be able to change, because the space is moving so rapidly that being too pig-headed about this is what I'm going to be, and this was what was in our white paper. We have to be this thing, and we have to do things exactly like that. Don't be afraid of change. Be fluid.
I love that. Yeah, being super nimble in Web3 appears to have been working for the builders so far to date. So I would definitely encourage people to take that to heart. Sarutobi, thanks a ton for coming on today. This was a bunch of fun. We absolutely have to do this again. Folks, if you do not already follow him, please do follow him on Twitter and go check out Yield Guild Games if you're not familiar with it. But with that, Sarutobi, we'll see you around, okay?
Thanks so much.